Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Aliana Kernodle. State government covers more than half of operational costs for mass transit systems in Pennsylvania's largest cities. Notably, it's not rider fares or contributions from local taxing authorities. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Pennsylvania editor, Kristen Smith. Kristen, how is mass transit in the state funded, and how does it compare to other states?
In Pennsylvania, state government provides roughly 50% of the funding for SEPTA, which is the Southeastern Regional Transit Authority in the Philadelphia region and its suburbs. And that's light rail, buses, the subways, the traditional, when you think of mass transit that a city would have, that's what we're talking about here. Pittsburgh has their own version of this, and they get 58% of funding from the state. And of course, there's other smaller cities throughout the state that do have their own bus systems and things of that nature. But when you look at other really large cities, and we're talking in specific relation to Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, because truly they are our largest cities, and they are the only two that are comparable to the other large cities in our area, which would be New York City, going further north to Boston, and even if you look out as far west as Chicago. In those states, their contributions are much smaller, somewhere between 9% and 30%. And this came up because of the context surrounding recent infusions of money to SEPTA. They're deep in the red as far as their operating budget goes, and they've been lobbying the legislature for more money for several years now. Things got worse after the pandemic when riders just did not come back. Some of the reasons would be changing patterns and where people are actually working. Are they working at home? Are they working in the city? And then there's also concerns about crime. There was a rising crime issue on SEPTA there for a while. At least it was more publicized than it had been in the past. And so people had fears about that. And so that is something that SEPTA, rightly or wrongly, has been trying to recover from. At the same time, because they rely so much on the state for their funding, when it came to making up the deficit that they're in after federal pandemic money evaporated, when it came to that, they felt that they only really had two directions to go, and that was to raise fares for riders and to ask the state for more money. And so they had gotten themselves into a situation where they were looking at double-digit price increases in their fares, and it would be the first of several, and they still wouldn't know how to climb out of the hole that they're in. They were going to have to do service cuts and things that would really jeopardize the lifestyles of 800,000 people who ride it every day to get to work, to get to doctor's appointments, to the grocery store, to school. And so there's been this real tension there of, should we give them more money? And if we do, what does that mean for the rest of the transportation infrastructure in Pennsylvania, namely its roads and bridges?
The legislature is out of session right now. This is a conversation that was sort of ongoing. They didn't come to any kind of conclusion about it, but the governor has tried to at least bridge the gap until some agreement has been made. What has he done?
On Friday, he announced that he would tell PennDOT to send $153 million from our federal highway funds to SEPTA as kind of a short-term fix until the legislature can come back next year in January and start coming up with a longer-term funding solution. This is on top of $80 million that the legislature did appropriate to SEPTA back in July with the last budget deal. And when Shapiro says that he wants the legislature to come up with a more permanent funding solution, who he's really talking to is Senate Republicans, because they control the Senate, Democrats control the House, and the House and Shapiro had agreed to 3 different proposals that would have boosted mass transit funding. At the top of that list is, for Shapiro, he wanted to spend $1.5 billion over the next 5 years on mass transit. And that's in addition to a lot of other spending priorities that he had. And Senate Republicans, they just will not go for a number that's high. Number one, because mass transit is a big problem for Philadelphia, for Pittsburgh, but we have some of the worst roads and bridges in the entire country, and we have a lot of them. And so when you spend all that money on mass transit, you don't leave a lot left to take care of these other roads and bridges. And you're asking everyone across the state to subsidize these mass transit systems that they will never use. And is that fair? So that's their number one gripe there. The second thing, too, that they point out is that it's a fairy tale wish list that he came out with. SEPTA had the strange decision to base their entire budget on it, so that when that money didn't come to fruition, they were in a very precarious position. And Senate's position is, well, that's not anyone's fault except SEPTA's. And so while they're open to helping them out and finding a different funding solution, there's no way that they're going to agree to what the governor wants or what other Democrats want, which is a significant funding boost and ongoing. The other thing that's at play here is the fact that it's not that Senate Republicans just don't want to spend money ever. In fact, they really came off of their hardline fiscal conservacy stance when it comes to education funding. And in the last 2 years since Shapiro has come on board as governor, we've increased public education spending by over $1 billion, close to $1.6 billion. And those are historic funding increases year over year. And so Senate leadership also points to that and says our pockets aren't that deep, and we spent the majority of what we had boosting education, which I think everyone agrees is something that is worthwhile, but you can't spend until we have nothing left. And then, of course, their concern is we're spending all this money, but are we going to make enough money next year and the year after that and the year after that to keep funding these things at the level that they're at?
And has SEPTA done anything in the way of restructuring or re-examining their routes, making adjustments, anything like that?
The Commonwealth Foundation, which is a conservative think tank based in Harrisburg, they actually did some looking into this and had said that for 60 years, SEPTA hadn't really looked at any of its service routes. And back in, I think, earlier this year or late last year, they finally did examine their bus routes, and they cut them down by 13% and then figured out which ones were considered frequent service. So that would make better use of the existing bus routes while getting rid of ones that nobody was using and that were costing money and obviously adding to the financial woes of the system. But there's other things that they could do. Senate Republicans really wanted them to kind of look inside of themselves and figure out why riders are reticent to go back, again, addressing crime concerns and safety and fair prices in general, and just really rethinking their entire structure, as it were, and finding more ways to save money, even if they couldn't find enough to bridge the gap that they are in, which I don't think anyone really expected them to. But even if they had made a concerted effort in good faith to do that, I think Senate Republicans would be more open to what Shapiro and the Democrats have to say about the situation. Commonwealth Foundation obviously backs them on this and is saying that SEPTA just hasn't done enough to show that it is truly trying to cut costs and be fair in that way, rather than just relying on the state to come up with more money. In broader context, too, it's not that the state is the only entity giving them a lot of money. In April, the Federal Transit Authority announced $600 million would be coming to Pennsylvania for mass transit efforts, and Philadelphia got $448 million of that, and Pittsburgh got another $83 million. So the large lion's share of this money went to Philadelphia to help them to modernize their systems, which would include designing new corridors, upgrading stations and tracks, things like that to make it function better from an operational standpoint and just from a technical standpoint. So, critics, Republicans, Commonwealth Foundation, they're saying that SEPTA just isn't making the best use of what they've been given here, and that if they want more money from the state, then they really need to hold up their end of the bargain.
Well, Kristen, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.